Good afternoon, everybody. 6 o'clock, going to start now. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. Members and officers, please remember to switch microphone on and speak directly into the microphone and switch off again after speaking. Reporting officers using Teams, please switch cameras on and use the hands up icon to indicate questions and comments. The chair will invite you to speak. The meeting this evening will be live streamed to the public, and a recording of the meeting will be available on the Council's website within 24 hours of the meeting. Any apologies?
We have one apology from Councillor Masood, Chair.
Thank you. Minutes 8th of March 2022 and 17th of May 2022. Agreed? Thank you. Any disclosure of interest? No? Thank you. Any urgent business?
None, Chair.
Thank you. Reference from the committees and other bodies. I think first report.
None, Chair.
Annual reports operation of the Council's Whistleblowing Policy and Equity under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000. Report of the Monitoring Officer.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. This report deals with two matters that I'm required to report upon to you annually. The operation of the Council's whistleblowing policy and any use that's been made by the Council of its powers under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000. In relation to whistleblowing, over the 21-22 municipal year, 10 complaints were received. And I have categorised them for the purpose of this report by personal interest or public interest. By personal interest, I mean those complaints which are predominantly about the interests of an individual. And these usually arise in respect of relationships with senior managers within the same organisation. Whereas public interest is where the complainant raises a matter that does not affect him or her directly, but nevertheless is of concern to him and her in the operation of something that he or she has witnessed. Of the complaints, 5 of them were received entirely anonymously. The remainder, whilst the complainant disclosed their identity, stated that they wished to be treated with anonymity, and that is not unusual when it comes to whistleblowing complaints. Obviously, strict confidentiality was observed both at the initial assessment stage and when complaints were passed to others for investigation. 4 of the personal interest complaints involved schools, and the usual practice following consultation with the school's HR service is to pass them to the Board of Governors of the school concerned to deal with. And as a consequence, they are closed to the whistleblowing process itself, although we maintain an interest in the outcome of those investigations. These sorts of complaints generally relate to complaints against, as I said, senior managers. They are the sort of complaints that would normally be dealt with through a grievance procedure or a complaints procedure, or even in some cases a disciplinary procedure. But because the complainant is apprehensive of the treatment they might receive if it were known that they'd made a complaint through those means, they choose, as they are entitled to do, to follow the whistleblowing route. There was a further complaint received in regard to schools, but that was immediately referred to the designated officer at the council for dealing with children's safeguarding issues. Two complaints were received regarding social care, and one of those were both public interest complaints, and one of those referred to alleged financial irregularity, which was raised with financial audit. The second complaint was referred to the relevant authorities, Ofsted and Central Bedfordshire Council, as the commissioner of the service for further action. Then there were a number of complaints which were considered as other. Two of those related to grievances against managers, and two of them related to misuse of council resources. One of the cases of grievance was dealt with by the Human Resources team through the grievance resolution procedure and closed to whistleblowing. The remaining case of grievance was independently investigated and not upheld. Of the two cases of alleged misuse of resources, it was found that one had arisen through custom and practice, which has now, as a result of the investigation, been discontinued, whilst the second was not proceeded with due to lack of evidence. There is no indication, Chair, that the policy is not operating as intended, and therefore no recommendations for development of the policy are being suggested at this time. Moving to the use of the Council's powers under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000, I can tell you that no activity, there was no use of those powers during the last municipal year. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you for your report, Mark. Any questions? Thank you. Moving to agenda item 8, Shared Anti-Fraud Service Report, and I think this is Delbars. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, members. I note that our reports were a late addition to the agenda, not to the agenda, to the bundle, and so are numbered slightly differently. If it's all right with you, Chair, I'll refer to any sections by the paragraphs on the individual reports rather than page numbers, because I think it could be somewhat misleading. Yes, good evening. We had some training earlier, so I think everyone is aware of who I am and who the Shared Anti-Fraud Service is, but just to outline why we need a fraud report, having an anti-fraud plan and a robust response is essential for any organisation, as it allows us to consider the areas of the council most at risk of fraud and target available resources in dealing with them. Being able to prevent fraud occurring in the first place is our priority, but understanding how and why fraud happens is also key to building an effective response. So the fraud report is item 8 on the agenda and runs from pages 8.1 to 8.14. I've included a copy of the anti-fraud plan for 2021-2022 that the Council approved at this committee in March 2021. At Luton, we deploy 4 officers to work exclusively for the council during 2021-22. The officers are managed by the Shared Anti-Fraud Service and have access to SAF's intelligence, data analytics and financial investigation expertise at all times. You'll see on the report in the next section the KPIs for SAFs. These were agreed as part of the plan for 2022, and I'm very pleased to advise this committee that working closely with our colleagues at the council, we were able to achieve or exceed all but one part of the targets for the year, falling just short of the 10 training sessions for staff and members. Unfortunately, we had some postponements of training because of COVID, and they're being scheduled in for this coming year. In fact, one has just taken place for members. So at paragraph 24, we deal with the effects of COVID, how they continued to impact upon our work throughout the previous financial year. However, SAFS was well placed in its general working practices to be able to minimise the impact. However, some of these areas were totally out of our control, such as joint working with the DWP, deployment and refocusing of staff to deal with the COVID response, special measures in dealing with interviews of witnesses and subjects of investigation, and a reduced capacity and progression of cases within the criminal justice system, magistrates and Crown Courts, and also the civil courts. SAFs redeployed resources to a prevent response during this period to provide a compliance approach rather than a fraud identification response. And any low-level fraud, priority was dealt with as compliance and priority given to the more serious allegations, as well as to the various COVID grant schemes administered by the council, and that is referenced at paragraph 26 of the report. One of our biggest aims is to help prevent fraud occurring, and working with numerous agents, we issued 20 fraud and cyber alerts to council officers in the last financial year. The reporting of fraud increased slightly, as you can see on the table at just below paragraph 32. And it is only a slight increase compared to previous years, and does generally appear to be a trend at the council in respect of reporting fraud. We think it's good news. It suggests confidence in the council's ability to deal with fraud effectively. And tables 2 and 3 also on that page explain the types of fraud and the sources of the people reporting the fraud. At paragraph 35, there's a report, there's some information regarding the successes and achievements throughout the year. We closed 98 cases, and of those, 65 resulted in recoverable losses of around £993,000 and savings for the future year of £463,000. 36 low-risk cases were dealt with in that compliance model mentioned earlier, and that resulted in £64,000 in additional council tax revenue. 115 cases remain under investigation in that year, and they carry an estimated fraud loss of £1 million. During last year, 17 properties were recovered. They were subject to some form of tenancy fraud, and they have been re-let to families from the council's housing register. A further 6 properties remained under investigation, and in respect to those, files have been submitted to the council's legal team to progress. SAFS provides an assurance procedure for all right to buy applications for the council, and last year we processed 125 applications for due diligence, and in the process identified 1 fraudulent right to buy application which we stopped. SAF supported staff misconduct investigations in the year for 2 members of staff who were disciplined or dismissed. And we then also supported the internal audit team and council departments working with a national fraud initiative. There was a huge amount of work completed, and I have to say that is the credit of all the members of staff and officers at the council. We provided an advice and guidance service as needed, but the work was theirs and the credit is due to them. Just a quick update on the our activity in the first quarter of this financial year. There's makes mention, I'm going to give you a verbal report. The most recent figures we have supersede some of those in the report, but a further 60 allegations of fraud have been reported in the first quarter. 122 cases remain open and live for investigation. The estimated value of those cases is £900,000. 19 cases have been closed so far this year, and they represent combined savings and losses of £214,000. 2 council properties have been recovered already this year, and at least one of them has been relet. I think one is in the process of being dealt with and refurbished, and we have already completed 56 right-to-buy reviews in the first 3 months of this year. At the end of the report, you'll see at paragraph 49 the data that the council is required to publish as part of the Transparency Code. And at that point, I'm happy to take questions on anything within that report members may have.
Thank you very much for your report. Any questions? Now, oh sorry, Underwood, go on.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a point of clarification, I think. Section 17.
Sorry,
Section 17? Paragraph 17. Says SAFs plan to deploy 4 FTEs to work exclusively for the council. On the table 1, it says 4 FTE on call at the council. That's the same thing, isn't it?
Different words, same meaning. Yes, full-time. The 3 full-time employees represent 3 counter-fraud investigators, headed up by Rob, who sits next to me as the senior investigator. So there's 3 working on cases, and the 4th is made up of a person in the intel function. I'm not sure if you were at the training earlier, but what we do for the intel member of staff, we spread that between our 3 team members and the intel, and so there's always, regardless if they're on leave, sick or absent from work, an intel function, which is one of the reasons why we can process so many right-to-buy application compliance inquiries. So, yeah, that's how it's made up.
Thank you. Just, sorry, Chair, one more. Your success rates and the fact that there's delays at the courts, long delays at the courts at the moment, is that affecting the figures for your success rates?
No, not overly. We prosecute criminally in the courts in very, very few occasions, and they're reserved for the most serious. As mentioned earlier in the training, a prosecution by the council is borne, the cost of which is borne by the council. So we're very careful in how we do that. So that really doesn't make a lot of difference on the figures. And the only one it would do is civilly, where last year we didn't make our targets for the recovery of social housing properties because the courts were closed and there were legal restrictions on evicting people. So because of COVID. That's why this year our target of 12 has been well exceeded by 17 or 217, and that is made up of some of the ones that we couldn't get through the system last year. As the courts have been freed up and things are moving, we are hoping that business as usual will return and the cycle will be on average 12 or thereabouts properties every year.
Thank you, Underwood. Any other questions? Thank you. I have one question from you. You know, when you pick the case for the prosecution or for the anything, is any money-wise is limit, like minimum is 500 or 200 or anything?
It's on a case-by-case basis. So there are lots of aggravating features that are considered. The decision ultimately is between the legal team here and the service, who are the budget holders that will fund that prosecution. So housing, revs and bends, adult care services. If you can imagine that a tenancy fraud could cost the council tens of thousands of pounds, but should there be a member of staff that in adult care services, and I'm not saying this is the case, but by way of an example, that has stolen 10 or 15 pounds from a service user, the gravity is escalated. So it's proportionate, but it's all about the case-by-case assessment.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, because if expenditure is going up and it's no point to recover that money, it's not like just 400, or expenditure is going very high, then to recover that money.
Yes, the prosecution decision is not always about just the money. It's about the nature and the seriousness and the gravity of the offending, which if it was a position of trust and that position of trust was severely abused, it wouldn't really matter potentially. It's not my decision, but my view is it wouldn't necessarily impact the value on the gravity and seriousness of the breach of trust. So this is why we say everything. It's very difficult to compare cases, but of a wide difference across the council, but everything is done to avoid prosecuting where we can, and only in the most serious cases.
And second question is, do you judge the case? Just say if like somebody fill up the forms, or some people are doing intentionally, isn't it? Some people is unintentionally. They fill up the forms like benefit, fraud, or anything. Do you give them chance first, judge the case, and you give them chance if you return over money, that's fine, or like if they did unintentionally, sometimes they fill up the form or something, information they're giving wrong, or lack of knowledge or something like that.
It's a rigorous investigation to make sure we've got the fullest of facts, not just about when the claim form was signed, who signed it, and what circumstances. It's about why it was done, understanding the nature of the individual that has inadvertently or deliberately made that false claim. And again, it's proportionate. I don't think any responsible council wants to spend good money chasing bad money that they're not going to get back. And those decisions rest with those people who know best, who in this scenario would be the Revs and Bens team. So we give them as much information as we can, the fullest of information to make those decisions. And they are the final decision makers in the case.
Yeah, thank you. Can I move to agenda item 9? I think review of the anti-fraud and corruption strategy and anti-money laundering policy and adoption of fraud, sanction and prosecution policies. Is that you again, I think?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Two of the policies have been revised, and one is a new policy for the Council. So we've undertaken a review of policies and updated and provided this new policy. The three policies should really be taken as a whole and are designed to protect the Council from fraud and economic crime, bribery, corruption and money laundering. If I can draw your attention to the first policy, which is Appendix A, which is the anti-fraud and corruption policy. It is pretty much self-explanatory, and the Council members will be aware of this policy as it was initially adopted in 2013 and has subsequently also been reviewed. This policy is a platform to inform, explain and provide structure for the Council to protect itself from fraud. And as I say, it's attached to Appendix A. The anti-money laundering policy, which is Appendix B, there's been quite a bit of revision to this policy, so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that. And the revision has come about because of the new Anti-Money Laundering Act that was enacted in 2017. That act is almost exclusively targeted at the regulated sector, the financial industry. So whilst councils are not part of the regulated sector, the Chartered Institute for Public Fraud and Accountancy advise that the principles should be followed by councils. The new legislation sets a more risk-based approach to anti-money laundering, with due diligence based on risk factors which are outlined within the money laundering regs of 2017. And these fall within the following areas: a general risk assessment, risk mitigation, the levels of due diligence, what reliance we place on third parties, politically exposed persons, new offences that were created, and importantly that the policy deals with a new role for the Council where the Shared Anti-Fraud Service will act as the Council's money laundering reporting officer. and both myself, the other council fraud manager, and the head of service have all received training for that, and will act as the council's conduit for reporting money laundering concerns. This policy will supersede the policy adopted back in June 2018. So whilst it is a revision, it is a very heavy revision, and old legislation has been substituted with the more current. At Appendix C, we have the new policy, which is the fraud sanction and prosecution policy. This policy, for the first time at the Council, brings together the Council's response to fraud across all departments and supports the fighting fraud and corruption locally, fourth pillar of Pursue. This policy will reinforce the Council's message that fraud against it will not be tolerated and dealt with robustly, and it will assist the Council in preventing and deterring fraud and corruption. The policy will act as a guide to how and when certain sanctions may be applied in an appropriate and proportionate way, and it identifies the key decision makers who will make those sanction decisions. There has been wide consultation across the Council in developing and drafting this policy. Turning further to down the report, where it deals with publication, training and embedding of these policies. The use, compliance and awareness of these updated and new policies have to become part of the fabric of the culture of the Council for them to be an effective deterrent, to afford the Council the protection they outline, and to become business as usual when responding to the threat of fraud and corruption. The policies need to be publicised at all levels, and all platforms are made readily accessible for subsequent reference. Training of staff is key, and we at SAFS are working with the Council HR team in reviewing, updating and indeed creating iLearn modules that also link back to these policies. The aim is to make the training mandatory and refreshed biannually to embed the learning into the corporate memory of the Council. The scope of these policies is wide-ranging. All Council employees, including volunteers, agency staff and councillors. Staff and committee members of the Council-funded voluntary organisations, Council partners, Council suppliers, contractors and consultants, service users and residents alike. It is also recommended that the Council's group companies consider reviewing their own policies to ensure relevance, appropriateness, and that they reflect current legislation and practices. That they formally adopt the policies, including an impact assessment on their own operations, also engaging with SAFs in respect of resourcing any counter-fraud work. These three policies are before you for your review and approval, and I'm happy to take any questions about them that anyone may have.
Thank you for your report. Any questions? Jackie first.
Evening, thank you. Given the fast-moving pace of technology nowadays, as we've gone through the digital revolution, do you feel that with the review periods that you've got in these policies are frequent enough? One of them is 3 years, one is as required. I think it should be a minimum of 2 years these things are reviewed. Not so much about legislation, but about the fast-moving pace of technology.
I think the policies need a review date to be set for them to be reviewed, but it doesn't mean that that's only when they are reviewed. So in the likes of legislation, if the anti-money laundering regulations were suddenly to change again, and they were last updated 2017, then we would look at them again. If there is such a dramatic alteration in a form of technology that affects any of these policies, then they can also be reviewed. I think our watchword is to always be alive and aware to the threat of fraud, and we should always be coming back to policies. But I think the guidance for the dates that are set are very much in 3 years or in 2 years, these need to be reviewed if they haven't been already. So there's always an opportunity to review the policies before their expiry date, and that would make sense in all circumstances when we're talking about things that relate back to legislation.
I hear your answer, but that's a bit wishy-washy, given that we're always reacting. And I think it would be useful if we were proactive and then plan ahead and say, right, in 2 years' time, we're going to see what has changed technologically, not legislation, and therefore we are ahead of potential corruptions.
It's a matter for the council. It's not within our gift necessarily, but what I would say is that there is always something new, and it is always difficult to predict unknown unknowns. There are things out there which we won't know about until we know about them, and there are things out there which we do know about and we can plan for.
You're saying we, the audit committee, can set the frequency of the reviews if we're not happy as a collective. Have I got that correct?
I'm looking at section 151, who's it saying yes?
If I can, Chair, absolutely, as Darren has mentioned, and as Kanchan will cover in terms of annual governance statement, and we've got an internal governance group which meet on a quarterly basis. We keep an eye on all these. So we've got Saru attending those meetings. So you're absolutely right, is if the committee would like us to review every 2 years, that's fine. But in our case, we look at things every quarter. We get statement from the department as part of the statement of governance. And if you've got any risks from an IT point of view, then from an internal audit point of view, we look into and we'll make changes. And if necessary to make changes to the policy, we'll do that. So constantly we are looking at, and you're absolutely right, that the world is changing and you have to keep pace with that. So having a set date, fine, we can put that. But we, on a quarterly basis, will look at everything which is happening to assess the risk and to see whether we have to change our control, change our policy, change our procedures, or change a bit our system. So it's a constant review which we do regularly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dev. I would like us to be proactive. Yeah, technology is changing, and some of the stuff I see on TV, people are increasingly getting scammed because of technology. Therefore, we need to be up in the game. So if I wouldn't mind if we have to refer it to exec, that as a council we are more proactive in the reviews, keeping pace with the digital way of getting money transferred, because that's what I think you're increasingly discovering, and we, the council, need to be proactive on our policies in moving forward. There may be a need for a bit of work to understand whether we've got the skill set to do that bit of work proactively, but given where we are, I want it on record that if my colleagues support me, that we are more proactive than reactive. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Javeria, please.
Thank you so much. I guess it's following on from what the Vice Chair, my colleague, has said. She's absolutely right on the digital risks and obviously the need for us to be proactive. But perhaps what we could do, if it's not already in the corporate risk register, perhaps include it as a risk that can actually be something that can be, regularly reviewed. But I guess ultimately with all these things, isn't it down to resources and being able to, find that expertise to be able to identify what those risks are. But it's just a suggestion anyway.
If I can come, Chair, absolutely we agree with what members are saying. But the point I've made here is we carry out regularly the audit of internal control, audit of IT system. We've got compliance like things like PCI compliant, PSI compliant. So there's a lot of things which we do already, which will give members the reassurance. Yeah, we'll give the members the reassurance. But absolutely right, we will put it in our risk register, and we'll have a date where whichever we are doing, we'll revise the. But a lot of guidance which help to give that reassurance. And those guidance not necessarily in the policy. So we've got financial regulation, we've got cash handling, we've got money laundering. So all those of things which we review anyway as a matter of course regularly. But absolutely we'll put that in the risk register. If there's an emerging risk, absolutely, we won't be waiting at the time that we'll wait. We'll do that anyway, as a matter of course. Thank you.
Sorry, Chair, if I can just come in. I think you're absolutely right there. So I suppose, although we don't directly deal with it, but at this moment in time, within our existing policies, procedures, systems, controls, whatever, it's already been dealt with or looked into and regularly reviewed as an active risk. Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
If I could just say, Chair, as well, also, SAFS has a seat on the risk board as well. So if we identify anything, we'll bring that to the risk committee as well. So you won't ever catch me saying, can we not review them every 2 years? Absolutely. Can we do it every quarter? And we look at those things. There's many risks that we look at. And also, as mentioned in the training, anything that comes out from the anti-fraud network in the wider community, we will be putting all of those things out. And as Dev knows, he's constantly getting plagued by emails in his inbox from us saying, watch out for this, watch out for the next thing. And just to put you all at risk slightly, because often there's not so much fear of fraud, it's the fear of it happening and the fear of what's in the media. It's ever present, it's out there. And someone used to say to me, there's nothing new in fraud, there's just recycling the same thing. So they're taking the same fraud practices and putting them on a different platform. And you're absolutely right, Madam Vice Chair, that these things come up and pop up in different ways. And as I said earlier in the training, it's like a friend coming towards you down that long road where you constantly have to be aware of what's going on. So I'm with you, I'm not against you, but we're already doing what you're suggesting in a less formal way and less resource intense.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Wahid. Sorry. Underwood, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. In the anti-money laundering policy, section 5.2. The key requirement on employees is to promptly report any suspected money laundering activity to the MLRO. So first point, it's not just employees, is it? It's us for a start, isn't it? It's elected members and anyone else who's...
I think that a generic term has been inserted there as people responsible to the council. But if I can give the committee a brief example. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the 151 level or Canch's level. We would implore everybody to report it. Everybody to report it. Let us make that decision, look at the background and deploy it, and that's the culture that we want to instill. And when we do the training, it's very much like that. And a very brief example is a junior employee at a bank said, I want to make a money laundering complaint about a man with dirty fingernails. He smells funny and he brings lots of money in on a Friday all the time. I think it's a money laundering thing. The boss said no. The member of staff made the report anyway, and when it went through the system, it came out at the other end that he was running a cannabis factory. So we don't want people not to make those decisions, to report it. We want them to make those decisions and let us then deal with it, because then that way everybody's covered.
Thank you. A follow-up. Should, as well as reporting it to the MLRO, should the person reporting it report it also to the S151 officer and the monitoring officer?
As soon as it comes to us, we'll be letting Dev know if he doesn't know already.
Thank you, Andrew. Before I go to Wahid, can I ask the members, do everybody's agree with Jackie's point? She's on earlier. Bert, can you make a note for Jackie's point on your notes for the exec? Wahid, please.
I just want to ask you if there is any mechanism to detect the frauds. My colleagues earlier on said that there should be some proactive in your system. So are you just rely on the complaints made by the departments or officers or elsewhere, or there is a system which actually detects randomly the fraud?
The council is a member of the Shadow Anti-Fraud Service Fraud Hub, and for those that know the National Fraud Initiative, this is a lighter version in that all the SAFS partners are members of it. So they can run data against their own records internally, and we can also run matches of data against the other partners' data as well. So, as I was saying in the training earlier, you border some of the other SAFS partners, which is very handy because people just travel, and therefore you can run a match on your own internal data as frequent or as infrequent as you want. The matches come out and then they're processed, and we support the understanding of what that data is telling us, and we help manage the upload of data and the output of the results to compare various different things. And also we then look at that data and say, well, where do we see some weaknesses, where do we see cases, and we will draw those out and work with the council officers in those particular departments that are running those data matches. And that's very effective use of a system that's already present, and means that in every 2 years, when the National Fraud Initiative is run biannually, there should be less work for everybody to do, because if you understand or know anything about the National Fraud Initiative, every 2 years you get a surfeit of results, and everyone's very busy trying to do that, as well as everything else, because it comes, unfortunately, getting towards the end of the financial year when everyone's tied up with lots of other things. So we're going to manage that data on a more frequent basis. That means if we do it more frequently, we'll identify the fraud or error happening earlier and can put a stop to it earlier and reduce the loss to the council. So that's our main data matching tool that we use.
Thank you, Wahid. Javeria, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I guess just wanted to seek a bit of clarification, if I may. So tipping off is a big offence under the various money laundering legislations. So I think it was in point to what one of my colleagues raised about, councillors and employees. I mean, obviously, under certain circumstances, as politicians, we may have additional requirements to report things, for example, to our chief whip. So, I mean, in what circumstances, for instance, if there is an issue, say, for instance, against one of our colleagues, for example, where we obviously need to notify our chief whip, but obviously at the same time, we've got to make the legislative notifications to our MLRO that we can avoid tipping off, because obviously, that's a serious offence. Maybe perhaps I'm getting a bit too technical, but I guess I just want the point about employees, and I guess because it applies to everybody, all of us. So yeah, I just want that clarified. Thanks.
So the completion of that anti-money laundering report, when it goes off to the National Crime Agency, is what is referred to as a defence against money laundering. Yeah. And what we're asking and telling the National Crime Agency is, we've got a concern over a transaction. We don't know whether it's money laundering or not, but we are making that report to you so that we have effectively a defence against money laundering. The tipping off thing comes in if we then do something without having made that report without the consent of the NCA. So whilst we widely encourage everybody to tell us of their concerns, we don't then widely go back and say this is what's happening for fear of anyone else inadvertently becoming privy to that information. And so we will speak to the person that referred it into us and say to them, please don't mention it, don't deal with that person until we tell you you can, because the National Crime Agency will tell us when we can and can't do something. So it's a very tight process. It will be a very short process of the number of people involved in the chain to prevent anything like that happening, and we would encourage those people not to be talking about it openly in any way, shape or form, because it is not just us as a council in the wider sense, it is also individuals that are captured by it and very inadvertently can. It's very rare that a prosecution happens because of the way policies and procedures are in place. It is, I would say, exceptional. I think there are 2 convictions in the UK so far. That's how rare it is. But it's a very heavy sledgehammer to deal with the potential of somebody allowing someone to commit money laundering. It's a preventative tool, effectively.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Dev, please.
Just to add from what Councillor Wahid's question is about detection. So I think the role of internal audit, and Kanchan can add, SAF role is when we come across some potential fraud, then we'll refer to SAF. But as part of the normal audit program, we'll be looking at. So sometimes department will contact Kanchan to say, look, here's an area we think probably there's potentially something fraud or irregularity or errors. So Kanchan team will go, we'll look at this, we'll carry out the audit, and we find something which we say, hang on, there's something more serious here, then we investigate, and then if we say there's potential fraud, then we'll inform SAF. So the detection mechanism, and that's the training which was provided, there's various mechanisms where we will be looking at and be more proactive in terms of the detection. And the other things, when we are making payments, so sometimes when you go in the creditor system, we carry out tests to see whether there's a duplicate payment. So whether the amount, date, numbers, similar. So we run that test, and if there are areas where we think there might be potential and invoice being paid twice, so that as well get carried out and we look into. So throughout the year, staff get involved when we say, here's a case where we've got probably there's a potential case here. But on top of that, there's things which you carry out as part of the normal process. And sometimes the staff who are looking at when they're paying an invoice, let's say in creditors, they will look at an invoice and say, that's a big invoice, but I'm just being hypothetical here, but there's no VAT registration number. So then we say, how come a business is operating, which has got a significant turnover, but the invoice is not a VAT number, or not a proper. So we do look at those things to see whether there's something telling us that we have to look a bit deeper. Not everything we have, but we keep that vigilance when we are looking at payments, we're looking at invoices, and we look at those things quite closely. And then if there's anything, then we get internal audit involved, and if there's more evidence and there's potential, then we get SAF involved. So it's a continuous process which we do throughout the year, and we try to keep an eye on to make sure we are on top of those things. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Kanchan.
Sorry, Kancha is behind you first.
No.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, the legislation is more about paying money away to people that we've received in. When you think about how a bank works, people put lots of money in and then they transfer it away on their behalf to other places. And that's the money laundering typically that you would imagine. In the circumstances of a council, where would we see things like that happening? Because if the council is the victim of fraud and paid money away inadvertently, that's not money laundering, that's being the victim of fraud. When we think about things like this, potentially some people overpay on their rent accounts for their council tenancy. Where is that extra money coming from? We don't know necessarily what's going on there, but if they make a request and say, I've accidentally overpaid my rent to the council by £10,000, can I have that money back? We need to ask why that's on there, especially if there are other markers or indications which suggest to us that that isn't quite right. And then also in the circumstance where we may be selling a parcel of land and we're going to take money in. What due diligence do we do about that individual, and where do we go, and what do we do about that, and how do we verify the source of that money? Because the last thing the council wants is to be tainted with the proceeds of crime money coming in, and then that money coming back out of the council because that person's being investigated by the police for the proceeds of crime, for whatever they've been up to, and then that money is then seized as an asset of that person, and the land is lost and the money is lost. So it's more about that circumstance than the wider, and very few occasions I anticipate this being done. It's not going to be daily or weekly or monthly.
Kancha, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, in terms of what Dev was saying, that as part of our audit work programme, we do consider the risk of fraud as part of the work that we do, and also how effective the controls are in place as well to address those. So I just wanted to kind of add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Juveria.
Thank you. Reason why I'm probably asking is because I specialise in governance, risk compliance, financial crime, etc. I suppose another example would be where there's a third party that makes a payment on behalf of a customer. So it could be a council tax bill that's paid by a third party who actually may be allegedly involved in a criminal activity and is in possession of criminal proceeds. So that's probably another example as well.
Thank you. Yeah, good.
And that's part of the procedure when we do the checks on the right to buys. where is that money come from and who's paying for it when it's not the tenant.
Okay. Any more questions? No. Thank you for your report. Moving agenda item 10, National Fraud Initiative Update Report, and I think it's Kancha. Thank you. Sorry, Underwood, yeah?
Sorry, Chair. For the last agenda item, we have to, we'll be asked to review and approve the policies.
For the recommendation? Yeah. Review of the council, sorry. Underwood, yeah. Review and approve the council's revised anti-fraud and corruption strategy. Review and approve the council's revised anti-money laundering. Review and adopt a new fraud section and prosecution. Is that recommendation for everybody? Yeah, approved? Yeah, thank you. Bert? Thank you, Underwood. Yeah, Kancha agenda item number 10, please, yeah?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. The National Fraud Initiative Update is an update on the work that we've participated in. So this is a 2-yearly data matching exercise set by the Cabinet Office. And what we do, we match key data sets, which is matched across nearly 1,200 organisations, both public and private. In terms of the outcomes that we received in terms of participating in that exercise, we received nearly 20,000 matches. And I'm pleased to say that the officers within the council reviewed approximately 18,000 of these matches. And as a result of that, they identified 14 cases of fraud and just under 3,000 cases of anomalies, which identified an estimated financial outcome of 5.4 million. So if I could just take you through that from paragraph 12 onwards. So in relation to the estimated financial outcome, for housing waiting lists, this was estimated as 4.7 million, for blue badges 131k, and for concessionary travel passes 28k. So this is based on a calculation of estimated savings set by the NFI. It's set per applicant removed from the system as part of the matching exercise. So the applicants could be removed from the system for a number of reasons, such as their circumstances may have changed, or they may no longer be eligible for social housing, for example, or it could be to prevent potential misuse of blue badges or concessionary travel passes belonging to someone who is deceased. For the housing waiting list, during 21-22, the service did carry out a data cleansing exercise. This information was used to carry out a bulk data matching exercise against the NFI matches that were received, and as a result of that, nearly 1,500 applicants were removed from the waiting list, and the estimated financial outcome is 4.7 million. And again, it's because of the set saving that the NFI have set per annual cost of the temporary accommodation and the likelihood that the applicants on the waiting list would be provided a council property. So it kind of increases the likelihood by clearing that waiting list. From the main exercise, this is from section 14, there were 97 cases totalling nearly £406,000 relating to council tax reduction scheme, housing benefit, creditors and grant recipients overpayments. So this is the actual physical cash income, if you like, which is currently being recovered at the moment in relation to those overpayments. Section 18, this discusses the Hertfordshire Fraud Hub, which Darren touched on earlier on. So this, this fraud hub operates using the same legal framework as the 2-yearly NFI exercise, and it allows data to be matched more frequently, helping to prevent fraud or detect it sooner, and it is intended to encourage more efficient working and prevent overpayments more quickly. And it is hoped that the Fraud Hub will reduce the volume of work created by the 2-yearly NFI exercise by identifying fraud and errors sooner as business as usual. If I could go back to the recommendation, the committee is recommended to note the update and the results from the Council's participation in the National Fraud Initiative exercise. I'm happy to take any questions on that, Chair.
Thank you, Kancha, for your report. Any questions? Does we need recommendation for this, Kancha?
It's just to note the work that's been carried out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bert, can you make a note, please, of that? Yeah. Thank you. If there is no question, We need to move agenda item 11, internal audit annual report 2021 and 2. Kancha again.
Thank you. If I could just spend a little bit of time on this one, because this sets out the actual work that we've carried out during 21-22 and the Head of Audit's annual audit opinion on the Council's control environment. So under the Accounts and Audit Regulations and the Public Sector Internal Audit Standards, I'm required to provide an annual assurance opinion of the Council's control environment and produce a year-end report which can be used to inform the annual governance statement. The annual governance statement is published in the Statement of Accounts. This is signed by the Chief Executive and the Leader, reporting on the effectiveness of the Council's governance arrangements over the past year. When forming this opinion, I do take a number of factors into consideration. So it includes the reviews that we've carried out during 21-22, including any limited or no assurance opinions that we've issued and any significant issues that we've identified as part of the work that we've carried out, the follow-up of actions against audit recommendations made, management responses to the findings and recommendations, any effects of significant changes to the financial systems, assurances received from other sources where this is available, and the extent of the resources we've had available to deliver the audit plan. If any matters that arise during the year which have threatened our independence or objectivity, those are also reported, and I'm pleased to say that no such instances have occurred over the last year in relation to the independence there. If I can take you through some of the key parts of Appendix 1, which is on page 7, so that's 11/7. Section 3, this discusses the audit plan. So the annual audit plan is risk-based. Our audit plan for 21-22 was set at 1,200 days, and throughout the year we did report to committee around the vacancies we've had in relation to the trainee auditor, and recruitment to this post was put on hold during the year whilst we carried out a review of the team structure. That team structure review has concluded, and as part of that we will be increasing the audit team's establishment from nearly 7 full-time equivalents to 8 full-time equivalents as part of the 22-23 audit plan that we have in place. As a result of this, the vacant trainee auditor post has been converted to a principal auditor post, and we will also be appointing an additional senior auditor post to assist with more work that we have planned for the council subsidiary companies. Our target to complete 90% of the audit plan is always dependent on having a full complement of staff. As at 31st of March 22, despite resourcing issues within the team, we completed 89% of the audit plan, which is a good achievement. During the year, we also had a member of staff who was on long-term sick leave, so the members of the team have really pulled together and have been working additional hours, and Mazars have also carried out some of our IT governance audit reviews. I am satisfied that there's been sufficient coverage of the plan and that the reduced levels of which were available to deliver the plan has not impacted the annual audit opinion. Section 3.9 of the report details the number of audit reports we've issued during the year. We issued 51 final audit reports, and a further 7 draft reports had been finalised after year end. Of those, we've issued 7 limited assurances and 1 no assurance, which I will come on to in a little while. In terms of the main areas of audit, this is detailed in paragraph 3.13. So as you can see from there, we cover a wide-ranging area there, from governance and risk management through to key financial systems, assurance audits, the follow-ups, the counter-fraud work, grant certification, consultancy advice, and third-party reviews as well. If I could pick up on the governance and risk management there, we did complete an annual audit review of governance and risk management arrangements, and I'm pleased to say that that resulted in an adequate assurance opinion. During the year, there have also been a number of activities to move risk management forward, and this committee has received reports on those activities. Service directors are also required to produce in-year annual statement of governance returns, and we use this as a basis to obtain assurance in terms of the compliance with the council's governance arrangements and its effectiveness over the past year, and a review of those returns did not identify any new significant areas of concern. As you're aware, we also had a local government finance review, which was undertaken by SIPFA on behalf of the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, and the review concluded that the Council has been proactive in managing the unprecedented financial pressures and challenges of income reduction from its airport subsidiary as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was also a monitoring visit for Luton Council's Children's Services conducted by Ofsted in December 2021. And as you're aware, a full Ofsted is currently underway at the moment in terms of assessing whether we have improved our outcomes. In January 22, this committee received the Council's external auditors' draft audit results report and value for money arrangements reports for the 18-19, and as you're aware, qualified audit opinion was issued on the Council's financial statements and value for money conclusion. Just to highlight some of the key issues that we've identified as part of our review, in terms of our key financial systems audit reviews, the review of the bank reconciliation audit identified that there were some significant issues with the new bank reconciliation module introduced in March 2021. Particularly, there were some functionality issues within the module which resulted in a high volume of transactions being posted to suspense. And these transactions had to be manually cleared, which proved to be quite resource intensive. It also made it incredibly difficult to accurately perform the daily bank reconciliations. These issues were escalated to the Council's IT provider, and regular progress meetings were held during the year to resolve those issues. At this point in time, we understand that the backlog of transactions in the suspense account is currently under control. Whilst daily reconciliations are now being performed, there is further required to resolve the daily reconciliation differences between the bank reconciliation module and the general ledger. It should be noted that this issue did not impact the monthly bank reconciliations undertaken. A large part of our work is assurance audits, and we did complete the majority of this to draft report stage, and for the majority of them there was an adequate or above opinion on that. In terms of the limited assurances, page 12 onwards, procurement contract management, again, this committee has received a number of reports over the last year around the issues we identified from procurement and contract management. We've recently carried out a follow-up review, and we're pleased to say that there is significant progress in terms of addressing the outstanding recommendations, and a number of initiatives have taken place to strengthen that in terms of having a new version of a procurement policy, having new online forms to ensure there's a consistency in approach in terms of procurement. There's been a suite of training modules which have been developed. There's also an increase in governance and oversight, as commissioning boards are now in place for each directorate, and they meet on a quarterly basis to ensure that non-compliance issues related to procurement are monitored and addressed. And the procurement team are also continuing to work with those areas where we identified non-compliance. So a number of activities are in progress to address those breaches. Rent deposits, unfortunately we've not been able to raise the opinion on rent deposits, and those weaknesses still exist in that particular audit. For homelessness and temporary accommodation, we issued a limited assurance opinion, but we're pleased to say that's been raised to an adequate assurance now. And similarly for our school audit reviews, they've been raised to an adequate assurance. There were 3 IT governance internal audit reviews which resulted in limited opinions being issued, and as part of our 6 monthly follow-ups, we will be carrying out first physical follow-ups reviews during 22-23, and further updates will be provided to this committee. If I could just sum up, all of this work feeds into the annual assurance opinion. Section 4 of the report provides that conclusion. So the conclusion is, whilst there are concerns on some of the areas that I've discussed, I am satisfied that an adequate level of assurance can be provided in connection with the Council's overall control environment. Section 3 talks about the statement of conformance with the public sector internal audit standards. This is something that we are required to comply with as an audit service. We have a quality assurance and improvement programme in place, and there are regular internal assessments and external assessments, and we are due to be externally assessed by the end of this financial year, which we are hoping to schedule in for Q4. And the results of that assessment will be again reported to this committee once that's been concluded. In terms of the outstanding actions from our previous assessments, there is one outstanding action which is being planned for this year, and this is in terms of an independent review of the performance of the Audit and Governance Committee in line with SIPFA's best practice. So this is something that will be scheduled in as part of this year to see how we kind of assess ourselves against the best practice and if there are any gaps we need to address. I'm happy to take any questions on that, Chair.
Thank you, Kancha. Any questions, please? Now, thank you for your report, Kancha. Just for the note, the committee is asked to receive the internal audit annual report for the council financial year 2021-2 and note the annual audit opinion on the council's overall control environment. I move to agenda item 12 is corporate risk update report by Kancha again.
Thank you. This is an update of the authority's corporate risks and the risk management work being undertaken. The recommendations for the committee are to note the ongoing work taking risk management forward and also to review the updated corporate risk register. Section 7 of the report discusses that the effective management of risk is an essential part of good corporate governance, and for our risk management process to be effective, it is important that we have a clearly defined risk appetite statement. At the moment, the Council does have a short generic risk appetite statement which only focuses on the high priority risks and does not consider, for example, how the Council's risk appetite would vary across different categories of risk. So we have commissioned the Council's insurance providers to review our risk appetite statement and to develop that. And there was a engagement through a survey and workshop with both officers and members in June 2022. A draft statement has been prepared, and as soon as that's been finalised, we will be in a position to circulate that with everyone. Section 11 talks about the 4x4 risk assessment matrix that the Council uses to assess its risk. In section 12, there is a table there which lists the criteria used to ensure that there's a consistent approach used to assess the likelihood and the impact of those risks occurring. Section 13 talks about the 4 T's of risk management in terms of the different strategies that can be used to manage the risks in terms of tolerating them, terminating them, treating them, or transferring those risks. At the time of writing this report, there were 36 risks on the corporate risk register. And since the update that was provided to the committee in March, the residual scores for 4 risks have been reassessed by the risk owners and 1 new risk has been added. And these are detailed in section 14 of the table there. If I could discuss the new risk that has been added. So this is in relation to the refugee and asylum seeker position in the town. So it's related to the volume and mix of people accommodated within the local authority and the overall risks around balancing support for refugees and asylum seekers and around the system pressures on core services such as social care, education, health and housing. So this has been risk scored by the risk owner as an 8, which is a medium-high risk. And there are a number of contributing factors to this, and this risk is being project managed and being regularly reviewed as part of that project. Paragraph 15 onwards, this discusses the huge pressures in relation to the increase of the cost of living. So since early 2021, with inflation now reaching its highest level in 40 years, it has caused financial hardship affecting ability of both households and organisations to afford goods and services, and it talks about some of the contributing factors for the inflationary pressures. To help households with the cost of living and rising energy bills, the government has announced a range of packages and some examples have been given there. For the council, although the largest inflationary pressures will be on energy and fuel costs, price increases are also expected to permeate much wider, including considerable pressures on contracts for key services which are purchased from providers. To deal with this, delivering the balanced budget in 22-23 will continue to be very challenging. Early estimates on the potential impact of price inflation for 22-23 ranges from 2.7 million, which is a low estimate, to potentially 7.3 million, which is a high estimate, and further work is required to refine this estimate. Given these expected pressures, there was a recommendation to Executive for 2.5 million one-off surplus from the 21-22 outturn position to be set aside in reserves in order to meet the expected increase in cost during 22-23. and this will continue to be monitored as part of the budget monitoring process, and it will also need to be considered for the 23-24 budget onwards. In order to kind of mitigate some of the effects of these significant increases, the Council will be utilising energy-reducing technology. There will be contraction of the corporate estate and educational building users, and funding will also continue to be applied for energy reduction projects. In addition to this, we will have to look at other ways of managing increased costs, and one of these areas would include a review of the pay awards and applying the statutory national minimum wage and national living wage as well. The section on section 21 shows the heat map of the council, and as you can see from that heat map, the majority of the risks scored by risk owners are medium high. There are currently 5 risks which are identified as high priority, and these are detailed in section 22 of the report. The key ones there are the failure to keep to approved budget, failure to recruit and retain staff. You've got the IT risk there in relation to loss or collapse of IT application hardware, and also the unauthorised access as a result of cyber attack there. The 4th risk is around the current demand profile. Poverty and looting continues to result in overspend on the agreed budget, and this mainly relates to temporary accommodation. And the last one there is around failure to improve the decline and look of the town centre. So these are currently the 5 high priority risks on the corporate risk register. I'm happy to take any questions on that, Chair.
Thank you, Kancha, for your report. Any questions? No? Thank you. Just for the note, the committee is recommended to note the ongoing work, taking risk management forward, and review the update corporate risk register. Thank you very much, members and officers. Thank you very much for today, and have a nice evening, and see you very soon. Thank you.